All right, let's dive straight in. What's tip number one for us today?
So tip number one, I've shamelessly stolen. I've stolen it from Professor Dan Willingham, and it is, let me make sure I get it right, it is review every lesson plan in terms of what the students are thinking about. And Dan Willingham says that he's Professor of Cognitive Science, I think, at the University of Virginia, and what he's trying to do is tell you what useful advice cognitive science can give teachers. So what do teachers need to know about how the mind works? And he said this is actually one of the most useful pieces of advice given everything we know about cognitive science. So it might sound really simple, it might sound really basic. I'll say it again. Review every lesson plan in terms of what the students are thinking about. And you might think that's really obvious. That's just really, really silly. But first of all, I'll explain why it's important. And then I'll explain, this is something that I did with my own teaching. I'll explain kind of the difference it means. So why is this important? Why is it important to think about what the students are thinking about? Well, it's important because it's all to do with long-term memory. We know that long-term memory is really important, and we know that all of the higher order thinking skills that we're interested in developing in our students depend on the knowledge we have stored in long-term memory. And sometimes as adults we can forget this, but just think of a simple example. You're just reading the newspaper in the morning, you're online, you're flicking through reading a few articles on your phone, and just to make sense of a typical article in a kind of a typical newspaper, the amount of background knowledge you have to bring to bear, the amount of vocabulary you have to know just to make sense of that, there's a lot of knowledge going on there. And as adults, we do all that automatically, we take it for granted. So long-term memory is really important. We need stuff in long-term memory. So the really key question for teaching then becomes, how do we get stuff into long-term memory? How do we get students to actually remember things? And Willingham makes the point that the brain, or what happens with the mind, with the brain, we remember what we think about. We don't remember what we want to remember. It's not that we say to ourselves, I've really got to remember this, make sure I remember it, and that works. We all know that doesn't work. So the brain kind of makes a bet. If I have to think about something a lot, it's worthwhile hanging on to it, remembering it. And that's often why there's a lot of things in life that you never really wanted to remember that have stuck in your mind. Perhaps things that you just, things that were pinned on the wall in front of you for like, I don't know, in a classroom or on a long bus journey, a particular advert, those things kind of stick in the mind because you're thinking about them a lot. So that is therefore why Willingham says, review every lesson plan in terms of what the students are thinking about. Because what they think about is what they'll remember, and remembering is really important. Like remembering is learning in a lot of ways. So when I tried this out, I remember reading William for the first time thinking, great, I'm going to give this a go. And I went through some lesson plans and I was like, what will the students be thinking about at each point? Now, obviously, the tricky thing is you don't always know what the students are thinking about. A lot of them are going to be daydreaming about dinner. But to the best extent, what is the aim of what do I try to get them to think about? And what I realised with a lot of my lessons is there were a lot of maybe quite complicated activities I was trying to set up that involved like a lot of admin and logistics and a lot of explanation. And so the students were thinking about all of those and trying to work those out and not necessarily about the content I was teaching. And so what it made me do is think, well, how can I simplify this and just strip it back a bit more and get to a point where we're just getting to thinking about, the novel that I'm teaching or, whichever grammatical concept rather than, a complicated worksheet or a kind of jigsaw, some kind of activity or, so keeping it really simple. And then following on from that, I think then it leads you to think that having a classroom where you do similar activities all the time is good because then it reduces the amount of time you have to spend explaining them. So if you particularly like Think, Pair, Share, and that's something you think is really powerful, then don't just do it once or twice, actually make it a routine because then you haven't got to explain it as much. So that was the impact out on my teaching. I mean, the other thing Willingham says is the example he gives in his book is a teacher who took a class to the computer lab to research the Spanish Civil War. And he said within minutes, the assignment, it went from research the Spanish Civil War to creating PowerPoint slides with cool animations of Spain in the Spanish flag colours, right? And so that's the other issue, is that a lot of the time you set up a learning objective, research the Spanish Civil War, and what are the students thinking about? They're thinking about, esoteric features of PowerPoint. So I think there's a number of different ways in which that a piece of advice is really powerful. And it's one of those, it seems really simple, but I think give it a go, and it's really, really interesting.
I love it, Daisy. One of my all-time favourites. Cool. I'm really pleased you brought this up. So two quick observations from me, then one follow-up question. So the first is I love the idea of these kind of common activity structures, like think, pair, share, something that you're going to use them several times so that you don't have to think about them much and the kids don't have to think about them as much, so you can dive straight into thinking about the actual content and the learning. I think that's a really, really important one. And the second one, just to reflect on a couple of ways this has gone wrong in my teaching. So in my first book, I talk about Swiss rolls. I tried to teach fractions via the medium of Swiss rolls. It was an absolute disaster. And 4 years later, the kids remembered the Swiss rolls, but not a thing about the content of the lesson. And Danny Quinn has a great example of this as well, where she tried to teach surface area of a sphere using an orange. And you start peeling the orange, and if you peel it, you can lay it out in the exact number of circles that you need. But one, it never works. And two, the kids just remember all the orange peel and, juice flying in their eyes and blinding them in left, right and centre. So there's loads of examples of this. And my follow-up question, though, Daisy, is this a good idea or a bad idea, putting it into lesson plans? Because you never see, in lesson plans, it's all about, what's the activity, maybe what's the teacher doing? Is it worth, if you have to do a lesson plan, banging in there what you hope the students will be thinking about? Is it worth making it that explicit, or do you think that's a step too far?
I kind of think it depends. I think when I trained to teach, every lesson plan had to be 15 pages long. I think everyone's sort of stepped back a bit on that now, quite rightly. So I actually wouldn't want to say anything that is going to add to the bureaucracy and add to that, because I know how things can get out of hand with lesson plans. So I wouldn't want to say that. I would say, you want it more like a checklist. The way, I guess pilots have checklists.
So I think when you talk about the oranges there's a really interesting point with that. I do think the principle I've just said, review every lesson plan in terms of what the students are thinking about. The slight tension that there is with that is another thing Willingham talks about is we learn new things by connecting them to old things. And so this is why analogy is so important. And if you think about it, that's a little bit in tension with review every lesson plan in terms of what you're thinking about, because you want the students to be thinking about what you want to teach them. But on the other hand, to teach something new, you need to activate the prior learning and connect with something previous. And often with subjects like maths and science, you're often doing that kind of concrete to abstract, and the fractions when you think about Swiss rolls or pizzas. But then, if you're spending all the time talking about pizzas, is that then interfering with, actually, we're doing fraction? And I've seen this happen with history too, and lots of lessons, where you're trying really hard to come up with an analogy, and actually the analogy ends up distracting rather than helping. And I don't think there's an easy solution to that. I think you do need analogies, and I think analogies are really important, so I'm not saying never use them. I just think that a good analogy is hard, and a lot of analogies that we as adults think are really great are not actually that useful, and they require more explanation than they do they actually enlighten. So it's a tricky one.
It is a tricky one.